This is Just Nowhere. Welcome, everybody. Here, this is your host, Dr. Samuel Zinner, in the mountain village of Aulla in Tuscany, Italy. Today, I have a very special guest, Professor Aria Razfar of the University of Chicago. Welcome, Aria.
Welcome. Good to be here. Thank you.
Good. You are a contributor to the brand new Routledge Handbook of Religion, Mass Atrocity, and Genocide. The editors are Sara E. Brown and Stephen D. Smith. I want to start off with the basic question. Can you describe this volume overall and how you got involved with it before we then move on to your specific contribution to it?
Yes, in the summer of 2018, I was doing a fellowship at the USC Shoah Foundation, which is one of the biggest archives of Holocaust and genocidal testimonies. And I had a number of interests when I went there initially, and I was interested in language policies in Germany pre-World War II. I became interested in medical ethics, but because the methodology that I employ is narrative analysis, I was looking at how testimonial research can be applied pedagogically in a number of ways. And while I was there, I was invited to contribute to this volume. Obviously, the Holocaust narratives, there's a very strong intersection between religion, identity, politics, and as you know, genocidal policies. And so this is how I became invited into this particular volume. And as you can see from the volume, there's a quite a uh, diversity of perspectives
Yes.
in terms of religion and mass atrocity and genocide.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's move on then to your specific contribution, of which you are a co-author, correct?
Yes, I co-authored it with the daughter of the only known Iranian survivor of the Shoah.
Let's see. All right, so since you use a narrative technique, just summarize what this human story is.
Well, like all good stories, it has uh, various components. There's a complicating event, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a story of identity. Um, when I first approached the family about this narrative, uh, I noticed that in the USC archive, the testimony of Menashe was missing, and
Mm-hmm.
I decided to reach out to the family. I found their phone number, and I contacted them. They had done an interview with the Shoah Foundation, or they had at least had contact with them. And so when I contacted them, I introduced myself. We met, and then we started to. Uh, that began the journey of sharing into the narrative of Menashe Ezrapour. Um, I remember the first time I met with Caroline. She showed me the diary that her father had kept while he was in France and in the concentration camps. The love letters that he wrote to
Mm-hmm.
a with someone with a Christian lady that he had developed a platonic relationship with. And what became very clear to me was how much faith and religion was a big part of how he navigated his experience while in Germany. And then what makes the narrative and the testimony of Ezrapour so compelling was that it is obviously connected to one of the great stories of displacement of the Jewish people in Europe, and also as destiny would have it, he would also experience another sort of traumatic experience when the revolution happens in Iran. And although it wasn't exactly the same types of policies and and outcomes that were happening in Germany was still a place that was hostile to the Jewish identity. And so
Mm.
there's a question that Ezrapour keeps circling back to, a question that his father asked early in his life: why is it so hard to be a Jew? This was a question that he asked his father when he was, I think, 8 years old. And then this question becomes very prominent again during the 80s while living in Iran.
Mm. Now, if I may ask, when one thinks of a trying time like this during the Nazi period, and a Jew holding a correspondence with a Christian, are you aware of the general topics in those personal correspondences? Were
Yeah, I
they
mean
religious, for instance? Did they discuss religion or theology?
the topics were not theological. The They were very general. They had a platonic relationship.
Mm.
They talked about daily matters. They talked about the classes that they used to participate in together.
All right.
And for the most part, they were not theological musings, but they were just a personal
Yes.
relationship that they had with each other. And you know, they were just talking about sort of the events of the time that they were experiencing. And you can see, for example, you know, as the experiences that Menashe was having in the labor camps. He would talk about sort of, there's no food. There's an empty stuff. He's always starving. But then he would, for example, thank God. And these sort of religious markers were prevalent throughout his correspondence. But not so much. They were not debating theological points.
I see. Well, yeah, I didn't have in mind necessarily debates, but just
Yeah, I know what you mean.
right. Sometimes in conversations between Jews and Christians, just the whole question of theodicy, or why is this suffering happening, or also sometimes we know there were dialogues such as involving scenarios such as Christians expressing outrage at what was going on, right, by being perpetrated by members of their own faith. Uh, so that's why I asked. So how do we move from France to Iran? So what is the how does the narrative get there?
So basically, after World War II, you know, thankfully he was not killed, although he did have a few close brushes with death.
Mm.
Um, a few times the Nazi officers came, but they did not. They thought he was a Persian. They thought he was a Muslim.
Mm.
And this is what he was sort of told to do, is to hide his Jewish identity. And he was able to escape death. He moves back to Iran, and he continues his life there, and all the way until the revolution in 1979, where the climate became dramatically different for the Jewish identity in Iran, given sort of the revolution's hardline stance against the nation of Israel. And so for Jews living in Iran, it was not a very comfortable situation. And but he lived there from 80 to 86, and uh, but definitely had some critical comments that he made about sort of the prevailing sentiment that was going on, even though Jews were considered a religious minority.
Hmm.
The hostility to Israel sometimes got conflated with the Jewish identity, and so on a social and cultural level, it became a very difficult situation.
Hmm. Hmm. And then so from Iran then his family eventually makes their way to America.
Yes, they come to America in the late 80s, and they continue their life in America. The Jewish community in Southern California, specifically around the West Los Angeles area. And I had the good fortune also to meet with uh, Rabbi David Shofet, who is the founder of the Nissaf synagogue in Beverly Hills. And my conversations with him about, because he was someone who knew Menashe intimately, and he attested to sort of the role of faith, not only in Menashe's story, but in other survivors' stories as well. So he quoted various authors and talked about how faith is really the reason for our existence. And so the testimony of Menashe is an example of that.
Hmm.
And David Shofer, the rabbi, he had a very long history in Iran. His father, he came from a long, maybe 12 generations of rabbis in Iran, and they are very, very intimately involved at various levels of the society. And they all migrated and started the Jewish Persian community out in Los Angeles with with the opening of the synagogue. And Menashe was someone who was a friend of David, Rabbi Shofet, and also they uh, they participated in many religious activities, social activities, cultural activities as well.
I imagine in your contribution, besides narrating the events before, during, and after, immediately after the Shoah, um, you have other emphases, right, in your contribution. What angle are you taking? What's specific? I mean, for instance, pedagogical uh, possibilities in this story, or so besides the summary of the narrative itself, right? How are you interpreting this narrative for scholarly purposes?
So one thing about narrative analysis that is important pedagogically speaking is that it helps us navigate an event, basically traumatic events. And so in narrative analysis, there's in the narrative analysis that I'm employing, we look at how human beings use narrative to navigate their issues of identity, how they move from different stages of trauma. For example, going from becoming extremely shocked to anger to negotiating, coming to terms with the trauma, and ultimately, how do they become empowered by these traumatic events? And as you know, students come to school with not only their own personal traumas, but also the collective traumas that they're a part of. For example, if you're an African American and you're in school, the trauma of slavery, indigenous people, Latinx people, they have various traumas that are collective traumas that they bring to school. And yet teachers often do not know or should know how to leverage these stories and help them become a source of empowerment and also be tools for academic development and personal development as well. So so this is an example of that. The title of our contribution to this book was called "The Power of One," and we came with that title because the story of Menashe Ezrapour is a very unique story. There are not that many stories of Iranian Jews who experienced the Shoah, and let alone not only did they experience the Shoah, but they also experienced another traumatic event in the revolution in Iran.
Mm-hmm.
So if faith can play a significant role, or a religious frame can play a significant role in helping human beings navigate these kinds of events, then it's important for us as teachers and educators to know how this is, how this works, and not to dismiss the role of faith. And I think the importance of this handbook in general is to understand sort of the role that religion can play positively in navigating these difficult events, these difficult human experiences. And when I took a detailed look at sort of the daily record and conversations that Menashe was having with his Christian friend, and also basically it was a platform for him to reflect his own experiences and to solve. This is what narrative is for. Narrative is a tool, as most narrative analysts would say, for us to solve our problems, to grapple with it. And in this context, you know, we talk about these narratives as emergent narratives, narratives that are not yet finished products, narratives that are sort of have conflating moral stances, dilemmas, and as we narrate, we are making sense of this chaos. We're giving order to the chaotic experiences, and so these testimonies have the potential to show us the power of human resiliency in these difficult circumstances, and also the role that faith plays, and in navigating these episodes of mass atrocity and genocide.
How do you think Menashe would, if one were to ask him, would he have a specific definition of the word faith? Of course, in Hebrew it would be emunah, but so in other words, what in general do you mean when you use this word faith?
You know, that's a great question. And I would say that one of the themes that was very prevalent and what he would define as faith, if I were to ask him, would be gratitude. Uh, and being thankful. You saw this was one of the most powerful themes that I saw regularly in his entries. So he would be talking about sort of coming back from labor camp, uh, being almost being pushed to the brink of death, and then at the end he would say something like Alhamdulillah, right? And he would use these Persian expressions. So he's a person of Jewish faith, but he's using these
Sure.
Persian expressions, and he was constantly, you know, using words like Inshallah, God willing, Alhamdulillah, praise be to God, and even he would even because he was corresponding in French, he would even say the French version like En sommes pas mal du merci, right? So he's always thanking God in all these various ways that he was communicating, whether it was Persian, whether it was French, whether uh, it was inspired by the Arabic expressions. It was this sort of call to a higher power, and he would also use Hebrew expressions as well when he was talking, when he was
Sure.
sort of calling out, if you will.
The Jewish Holocaust survivor and psychologist Viktor Frankl, right, the author of this classic, the Meaning of Life, right, his basic argument was that Jews and others were more likely to survive the death camps and the Nazi work camps if they could find a meaning in life and some meaning they were looking forward to, right, after this would be over, right? So if one could not find a meaning, one's chances for surviving are plummeted drastically, catastrophically. So do you think that we could say for Menashe that the meaning that he found was this gratitude, this outlook of gratitude, or was there
Absolutely,
something that and something
absolutely.
else? All right.
When I was meeting with Rabbi Shofet, and he was talking about Menashe, and he was saying Menashe's story and his narrative is exactly what Viktor Frankl was talking about. He actually made this connection,
All right.
and in terms of describing the role of faith, and without faith, we're basically nothing. This was the rabbi's stance, and he kept emphasizing this fact that those with faith, those who believed in a higher power and also connected, were more likely to be able to navigate such traumatic experiences, and really show the role of faith in mediating our our well-being and our wellness in these times. And I like to also add that while I was at the foundation, I came across uh, a number of testimonies that echoed this type of resilience. In particular, the story of Eva Kor, whose story is very famous and known to many. She also had a twin, and was one of those who was experimented on by Joseph Mengele, the doctor of death, or the angel of death. And she's somewhat of a controversial figure in the Holocaust survivor community, because she developed this. She would very publicly talk about how she brought herself to forgive Joseph Mengele, and actually met him face to face, and developed a philosophy of forgiveness that was very much empowering, and not so much. She was very clear that this is not about legitimizing the actions of the perpetrators, but rather releasing oneself of the sense of victimhood. And in the story of Menashe and also Eva Kor, I found this theme to be very powerful, that they had this incredible ability to see the light in a sea of darkness. And they were able to maintain hope and their love for humanity, despite all the inhumanity that they were surrounded by. And this is a very powerful message, and this sort of helps us if we can, for me personally, if we can get through these types of experiences, then we can get through all the lesser types of traumas that we inevitably will experience.
I know the Hebrew word for faith, as I mentioned, emunah, right, has these valences of confidence and reliability. So if we want to correlate that with gratitude, then I suppose the constellation, right, that comes out of that would be being grateful to the divine one that can be relied upon, right? But in any case, now the title of your chapter that you've co-authored, The Power of One, I don't know if I'm reading this into it, but is that intended to be either a double entendre or even multivalent? Because, thinking of Jewish ideas, Jewish theology, right, immediately one is going to think of, the power of the one, God, right? And also that God is one, but also it's very much stressed in Judaism that Israel, although it's a plurality, Israel also is one, right? And so that uniqueness of Israel and God, right, sort of overlap, right, and are shared. So is there an intentional double entendre in your chapter title?
Well, now there is.
All right, so I read that in there.
That's a
And
great take on it. Initially, the power of one, as you know, in Jewish and Abrahamic theology, oneness, echad, is a very cornerstone concept. And
yes.
in research, in sort of social science research, especially qualitative research, we are always in this bind of making the case of the significance of a single case. And so a lot of times we think of something counting only if it's large in numbers, right? Or it's only significant if there's many instances of it. Well, here we have a narrative, we have a testimony of one person, and a person who doesn't fit sort of the predominant demographic of this historic event. But this narrative is still significant, and testifying to this narrative and sharing this narrative is also significant. And so uh, we become keenly aware that oneness and significance is not so much a discrete entity, but rather it reminds me of an ancient mystic saying that in each person, in each human heart, the entire universe resides, right? And so if we're able to extract this universal story from each testimony, then we can see its power. And every person should see their story as significant. No matter where you are, no matter what you're going through, you should never feel alone or apart from the cosmic and universal reality that we're all a part of. And I think that's what our faith, that's what I learned at least from engaging this testimonial research, is that one narrative, one testimony, and then our participation in that story can help us become whole and connected to the broader universe and our cosmic reality. So yeah, I think the power of one here is a double entendre that sort of speaks both to the social scientist who might not ordinarily consider a single case as being significant, and also to the oneness that in that one person is the oneness of the universe, or the oneness of God, if you will.
Sure, sure. A pedagogical point. I wonder if you've considered this point, um, and this is even, I think, relevant for social workers, psychologists, for instance. Um, in in the experience of genocide, we can look at an individual, and there's definitely going to be wounds, right, that can be addressed. But the problem is this: I find there seems to be a lack of understanding among historians of genocide, and also, as I say, social workers or psychologists. There's this what's a multi-layered wounding, right, that has taken place in an individual. Because if the individual, for instance, let's say Native Americans, um, if a person belongs to a people that has been the victim or the object of genocide, an individual, right, can receive counseling, for example. And sometimes there might be frustration that this individual never seems to be able to achieve complete healing. And the reason for that often is that until there is a healing for the group as a whole, the individuals within the group can never achieve complete healing, right? So it's operating on more than just the individual level. If that individual, right, has been targeted because of the ethnic group or religious group or whatever kind of group to which they belong, right? And so have you ever considered this aspect or this dynamic?
Absolutely. I think part of part of this narrative approach to narrative is that the individual is also part of a collective. That there's a grand narrative, there's a collective narrative through which we are making sense of our lives, and that collective narrative also has to be redeemed. And so I think this is what you're talking about, that until there's this collective healing, and I think you can talk about this with any uh, non-dominant or oppressed group of people who have
Mm-hmm.
a collective narrative, and a traumatic experience that's still an open wound. And and I would say that's not just, uh, that healing is not only for the victims, but that healing is also for the perpetrators. So the dominant groups and the non-dominant groups collectively have to reconcile. They have to redeem themselves. and become one through each other, through this joint storytelling and joint meaning making. So I absolutely agree that, I mean, language, narrative, these are fundamentally social phenomena. So in order to for traumatic experiences to be healed, it has to happen on the collective level because it's inherently collective. It's inherently a social story. So this type of collective cathartic experience is what some scholars have called perejavani. Uh,
Mm.
this type of group type of healing that has to take place, and our individual narratives are never apart from the social, from the
Right,
collective,
right.
and so we are interconnected, and so each of our stories on a micro level is also part of a macro narrative that's unfolding, and both for the victims and the perpetrators, the dominant and non-dominant, uh, this kind of reconciliation has to take place.
Mhm. I brought up uh, the the situation of indigenous peoples in the United States because the book to which you've contributed, although your contribution is on a Shoah survivor, right, it's also right, a very comparative book dealing with
Right.
many different groups throughout many different time periods. And but I think you've done a good work because it's shocking to me. I guess it shouldn't be, but it is. Right, the level of ignorance of the Shoah, of the Holocaust among the younger generation. Right, I grew up under the impact of the Holocaust, and so it was very much emphasized in the California public school system. Right, when I went through it, and the degree of ignorance of the Holocaust is really shocking to me. And so the historical works and education on this topic is really the only cure. But right, it doesn't help that
Yeah.
there's also often prejudice in in higher education administration. I remember a conversation with someone I knew. It shocked me when I was in grad school and university. Someone who's a professor expressed his outrage at how indigenous peoples in America would destroy the homes that the government would supply them, right? Whether those were trailers or mobile homes or whatever. And I told him, well, if if I were used to a certain way of life and someone uprooted me and told me to live in some domicile that just did not agree with my philosophy of life, my way of life, I'd probably destroy it too, right? And but it was shocking that to personally encounter this kind of attitude on the part of someone, right, who is in a position of authority and to whom students look up, and they get formed by the attitudes and the values that they hear from people in authority, right? And so you've done a good work, and also to bring it back to the Jewish community also. Right, there is well, Kane West, right, is just the latest example of how anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish sentiment is can still be a part of the public and popular culture, and which is very hurtful to the Jewish community, and of course beyond to anyone of goodwill.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple of points I wanted to really emphasize, and especially in light of the the testimony of Menashe Ezrapour,
Mm.
and that is, and this volume in general is dealing with so many different genocides, and also moving sort of the the needle towards a non-Eurocentric view of the Holocaust. And so a lot of times people think of the Holocaust and World War II as simply a European phenomenon, only, something that only affected European Jewry. But this is a way of also talking about this as a global phenomena, and shedding light on a story that represents both the Eastern and the Western, right? So Menashe is sort of a hybrid case. Someone who is from the East, happens to be in the West, grew up in a Muslim-dominant environment, is going to school in a Christian environment, and so you have this religious hostility being unleashed against the Jewish population, and so you get all these complexities of identity, and I think when you're forced to transcend all these identities, that's where I think religion at its best can serve as a very important element. And I agree. I think there's a lot of, I mean, in the last 10 years, for example, we saw like in Iran, they would have like this conference that was questioning the Holocaust or trying to do new research on it. And I think what people don't realize is that this type of action is basically a reactionary move of a traumatized people to lash back at those who they feel are their oppressors. And so as we try to navigate these complex issues, and unless we collectively heal these traumas, I mean, and the first step to healing is to recognize the trauma. So recognizing the Armenian genocide, recognizing the Rohingya, the Myanmar. So I mean, we can see that all religions in the world have been on both sides of this camp. They have been used both as a way to create genocide, but they've also, at its best, it's a tool to help us survive it. So it's both light and darkness at the same time. And so I think, this book, this volume, this narrative, this project that I participate in help me personally see that more in detail, and hopefully can develop a tool, a pedagogical tool, to navigate the nuances of these types of human experiences.
All right, very good. Well, Aria, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it as well. And I look forward to continuing the conversations.
Sure. And everybody else, thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe and support the channel through Patreon or PayPal. Thank you.